Welcome to SpringLaw's Spring Forward Legal Updates webinar series. This series is designed to provide a comprehensive legal overview of key issues related to employment law and human rights in Ontario. SpringLaw is a virtual employment law firm advising on workplace legal issues for employers, employees, freelancers, and executives from a wide range of industries. We hope you enjoyed today's webinar and find it useful and informative. To reach our team, please visit us at springlaw.ca. And now to our presenters.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our Spring Forward legal update. Today we're talking about barriers and biases, a topic that we haven't talked about yet, so we're both very excited to present on this. My name is Lisa Stam. I'm the founder and managing partner at SpringLaw, and joining me today is my colleague Danielle Murray. If you're one of our clients, you already know we're both employment and contracts lawyers here at our virtual law firm based out of Ontario. For anyone who's new, welcome to our webinars. Feel free to ask any questions you may have in the chat function, and we will do our best to get to them. And if we can't during the webinar, we'll get back to you after. Feel free to download the slides in the handouts tab. And finally, if for more information about our firm or about employment law generally, please come visit us at our website at springlaw.ca. There's a bunch of resources there, including our award-winning blog, a free employment contracts checklist, a subscription to our monthly newsletter, and a bunch of information about our innovative programs for employers, including our subscription program and some DIY legal products that we have. So let's jump in. Now, while it is Danielle and I who are presenting, we do want to acknowledge and thank Jess Raposo, our Director of Marketing and Innovation, who helped us research for today's presentation. We wanted to make sure that our information is backed up by stats, and she did a great job of helping us out with that. This is a topic that's near and dear to our hearts and something that we definitely handle every day in our practices. First of all, we would like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and that this territory is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. And because we're lawyers, we also would like to acknowledge that this is not a legal advice today, it's just a webinar of legal information. You can read this at your leisure at some point. All right, presentation roadmap, over to you, Danielle.
Okay, thanks. Hi, everyone. So today we're going to be talking about statistics on women in the workplace, women in leadership and the challenges that they face, when hiring women, pitfalls to avoid, how to support women in the workplace, and finally terminations and pitfalls to avoid. So we'll start with stats on women in the workplace, which are a bit sobering, so we won't spend too much time on them. But basically, women's hiring into senior management positions reverses backwards in 2020. That's what's been found. And you know, women at all stages of employment experience workplace bias, from job applicants to presidents. That we know. So on the plus side, women have made considerable strides in the labor force over the past decades. Women are generally working more hours, pursuing higher education in greater numbers, and holding more prominent positions than ever before. The downside is that, as we know, there still remain inequities between men and women in the workforce, and these inequities remain pronounced. And for the second year in a row, the World Economic Forum Global Gender Gap Report in 2021 indicated a reversal in the global movement towards gender equality. So future generations, unfortunately, will have to absorb these imbalanced gender perceptions. We'll get into that a bit now. So go ahead, Lisa.
Yeah, I mean, we first of all do recognize that we're preaching to the converted probably on this webinar, and so we know that Most of the people that are listening are here because they are engaged and want to improve. But there's a great website, Catalyst, for those that may not be aware. They have a whole bunch of great resources around women, equity and women in the workplace. And they have a great page around making the business case. So for those of you that are, trying to still convince the powers that be in the organization that it's worth it to invest heavily in equitable hiring and addressing inequities in the workplace, there's lots of business case reasons to do this as well. So, DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's not just a nicety, it really is a good business decision. And so here's just some great resources to help you make the case if you need that. Our webinar today is only 30 minutes, so we can't deep dive into the topic of intersectionality, but we really wanted to acknowledge that this is absolutely a critical component of any true diversity, equity, and inclusion approach or program in your organization. Much of the stats, pretty much many or most of the stats, are really based on the experience of Caucasian women. And written by Caucasian women. And so they, white women continue to have the privileged best case scenario. So for anyone who intersects with women in the workplace, whether it's on the basis of race or gender or in the LGBTQ plus community, disability, etc., all of these stats are just amplified. So I think it's just important to recognize that there are greater barriers and biases that we would have loved to cover in more detail, but we have 30 minutes. So I just wanted to acknowledge that up front, and we will jump into the Women in Leadership Challenges.
Okay. So as we know, women do face challenges in the workplace, especially in leadership positions. Here are some more stats. You can just for your information here, don't need to go into it for too long, but the reality is that women are still underrepresented in private sector leadership positions. And there are likely multiple drivers of this. One that is, definitely outright discrimination, denying women jobs on the basis of their gender rather than their skill sets. And we'll get into that as well. And the tendency for women to be subtly dissuaded from pursuing leadership roles. As a result, women may never pursue these roles. They might get talked out of it based on how the opportunities were presented. So there are definitely some challenges. Next is the impact of COVID-19. I mentioned there's a reversal in the first slide, and there's been interesting stats on the impact of COVID-19 on women in the workforce. So many women have left the workforce due to challenges during the pandemic. Childcare issues were a big driver of that. So the pandemic has had a large impact on women in the workforce. And as the impact of the pandemic continues to be felt, closing the global gender gap has increased by a generation, which is what the World Economic Forum's Global Gender Gap report in 2021 has found. However, women who have stayed in the workforce have been found to have emerged as the heroes of the pandemic, which I've found was a pretty interesting finding. There's an article from the Harvard Business Review that says that women who stayed in the workforce and who excel at wise compassion have emerged as the heroes of the pandemic. And there's a recent McKinsey report that confirms how women are rising to the extraordinary moment as stronger leaders and taking on the extra work that comes with it compared to men at the same level. So there was this McKinsey report had a study of 65,000 employees. Women managers were scored higher by their employees as taking the people-centered actions that helped them through the pandemic. such as providing emotional support, checking in on overall well-being, and taking action to help manage burnout. So there are some positives, even though, you know, women have taken a hit professionally due to the pandemic. We'll talk briefly about the wage gap. There remains a wage gap in the US and Canada. And for Canadian women of color, unfortunately, the wage gap is even higher. Leading causes of the gender wage gap include many things, included gender segregation in jobs, caregiving responsibilities that fall heavily to women, a lack of pay transparency, discrimination, and bias. And we'll get into that later.
So now that we're all reminded of the dire facts, what are some practical strategies to address all the disparities? So the rest of our session today is really to talk about some strategies and, you know, the anecdotal observations we've made of our clients that are doing it well. You know, we want to share some of the pro tips that we've gathered along the way. So how to encourage women to apply to leadership positions. This is a really interesting stat. I remember running across this at some point. It's cited in a Forbes article this year, but I've seen this before where men tend to apply for jobs if they believe that they only have 60% of the qualifications, whereas women tend to only apply for jobs if they believe they have all of the qualifications. And so this really leads to how it's some good takeaways on how to structure your job postings, right? If you are trying to attract a more diverse application pool, you know, do you really need to have all of these specific criteria, like, you know, 15 years of education and experience and this and that? Or are those must-haves, or are they nice-to-haves? And giving it a little bit more flexibility if it isn't a mandatory piece of the job. Obviously, if you're, you know, an accounting firm and you're hiring an accountant, they have to be licensed, right? That's fine. But for other jobs where it would be nice to have someone who's 10 years out, but you know, you might want to think about how you're structuring your job posting to attract people that may believe they should only apply if they have 100% of the qualifications. Another consideration in the interview process is to think about questions that you should ask or shouldn't ask during interviews. So in the States, it's now illegal to ask for past salaries in nearly half the United States, the states of the United States. The purpose of this is to try to end that cycle of the pay gap. If someone comes in and you say, hey, how much did you make your last job, and they have been chronically underpaid, you're only, and then you try and top that up a wee bit or match it at least, it just perpetuates the pay inequity. So, you know, about half, I think it was about 21 states at this point, have just banned the ability to even ask what was your last salary altogether, with some reprisals if you do ask. Now in Ontario, under the last Ontario government, there was some legislation that was passed back in 2018 by this is a political thing, so I will not get into this, but I will simply state it was passed by the Liberals, and then the new government came in and paused it, and it's continued to be paused. So we actually have a Pay Transparency Act enacted in Canada that's not in force. So the legal nerds that are listening will appreciate that distinction. It exists, but it's not enforceable yet because it's been formally paused. I don't know until when or what, but I do think it's a matter of time when as all the states start to roll this out, that at some point Ontario will need to catch up. The bottom line is it's never a good practice to ask an employee what they earned at their last job because of pay equity issues. Other hiring tips, I already mentioned this, give this wider range of experience and really think through what's a must-have versus a nice-to-have job criteria. The questions to absolutely avoid during an interview because of human rights issues are marital status, family status, whether they plan to have children. Now, I think this is probably pretty obvious to most of us at this point. What I have observed, though, is that these questions or versions of these questions tend to come up in good faith conversational type conversations with candidates where you're trying to get to know them. You want to, find some common ground. You want to make it comfortable for everybody. And so, you might talk about your own kids a whole bunch. It might appear or feel to be a bit of bait to the candidate to start talking about their kids. And really, we want to avoid anything that could give rise to a claim that, but for, the fact that I talked about my kids or, or my marital status, my family status, I would have been hired, because then the candidate has a human rights claim. So these are just some of the questions to absolutely avoid. So what are some big picture strategies for supporting, now you've hired the candidate, what are some big picture strategies for supporting women in the workplace? So research has showed that women at every level tend to receive less support in their transition to leadership. We have to remember that most companies, especially older companies, and really our Canadian workforce is based on a system that has existed for a long time, that historically is created and run by men. And so when you're inserting people into that leadership that may not be from that historical group, they will need at least as much support as their male peers. So women tend to report higher levels of stress in that transition period, and a larger percentage of men indicate they felt they were given clear expectations for success in the role than women. So there's we're trying to put all of our sources everywhere in all these slides so that there's further research that you can look at. But this like I said, if the existing leadership is a certain group and you're inserting a new member to that group, they will need at least as much support. Microaggressions are real. I think this as employment lawyers, this is exactly what we hear about every day when we're on for the employee. Women executives, when they come to us, we hear about all of these little things that happen all day long that in isolation would not be a giant deal. But it's the accumulation of all these everyday slights, indignities, put-downs, and insults that members of a marginalized group experience in their day-to-day interactions with individuals who are often unaware that they have been engaging in an offensive and a demeaning way. Now, this is from this fantastic article from a colleague of ours, Megan Keenan. I put the link to her article in the Advocate Society Journal from from last summer. It's a really great article that just describes all the different microaggressions that she as a lawyer has experienced over the years. So for anyone who's listening who's a lawyer, it's a really great piece. And so that's a quote that she had in that article. So examples, this is a long list. These are all things that I think most women have experienced. Again, intersectionality matters. Anyone who is intersects with being a woman in the workplace can triple, quadruple this list for sure. So you can read through all these things, but little sayings like, "Oh, let's man up," or "Don't be so sensitive," or that they're so politically correct, or "It's just a joke." Assumptions that you're an assistant rather than the manager or leader in the room. Calling people women by their first name, but men by their last name, or when you come into the boardroom saying, "Hey, gentlemen," but there's a woman in the room. It's these microaggressions that are friendly and jovial, but add up to a problem. lots of strategies to address this. A key one, and there's a great article here about microaggressions at work that is mostly about this intersectionality piece and race. So it's a really great piece to look at. But the author there speaks about addressing each of the microaggressions as they happen. Don't let it accumulate. Don't overlook microaggressions as honest mistakes of the people who made them. Use it as a learning opportunity to proactively, politely, positively address them, and then allow for space for follow-ups around it all.
Okay, more strategies. So I recently listened to a podcast with Adam Grant, an organizational psychologist, and he was interviewing Indra Nooyi. She's the former CEO of PepsiCo and a leader in the business world in the US, an Indian American woman. And she was talking about her experience in women in the workplace, etc. And she was saying how throughout her career, she always lived under her means. So she made sure to do that so that she could have the confidence to walk away and afford to take risks and say things, to stand up for herself, as she was one of the only women in the workplace when she was throughout her career as a leader. And so she said that was a tactic that she used to make sure that she was never put down at work. And she says, be valuable on the outside so you can be valuable on the inside, which I found was really interesting. And, that's an interesting approach that she says she doesn't recommend to everyone. And, not everyone can afford to do that. If you're the sole income provider for your family, or if you're single, or if you're the primary income provider, you can't necessarily take those risks. So it just made me think, as employers, what can you do so that women in the workplace and women leaders don't have to do that. They don't have to even think of doing that. And one is just creating a safe environment for women to express their concerns. That can be done in different ways. There can be a lot of brainstorming on how to do that, but just fostering a work environment where women can express their concerns and stand up for themselves and not be subject to all these microaggressions. That's one strategy, and we welcome ideas on that. And there's just so many different ways that can be done. Whether it's taking anonymous feedback from all workers on how to improve and how to better support women in the workplace, to just having someone who's willing to speak to women about that, and that women don't feel like there'll be a reprisal if they do that. If they do so. Second is supporting employees with families. Not just women, but all employees. We do know that one of the main reasons women leave the workplace, or they don't enter leadership positions, or they leave leadership positions, is because of the workplace culture around them having a family. And Indra Nooyi actually addresses that as well. She says there's a lot of talk these days on the future of work and technology, efficiency, and productivity, but there's not enough talk on families, how to support families, and how to support women with families in the workplace. So ways of addressing that is instead of seeing it as it's not you have a family, you have young kids, that's your problem. That needs to be changed, and employers should take into consideration the fact that their women employees or women leaders have families, and how can we support them? How can we support them in the workplace? One is avoiding stereotypes. Assume that they can and will work just as hard as workers without kids, and how can you facilitate them to do that? Accommodation and support. Figuring out what they need. What kind of accommodation do they need? What kind of support do they need? Is it flexibility? Is it the option of remote work? And Gerard Nui again talks a lot about remote work, how she would have loved to have had that option in her day, where she wasn't able to be home, and if she could have worked remotely, she would have been home, to see her kids when they came off the school bus after school. On the flip side, in this podcast, they were talking about remote work can also have a detrimental effect on women. Where if the culture is still very much that, being in the office is important and shows that you're dedicated, and a lot of the men or people without families are the ones showing up in the office, they're getting more face time with the more senior executives or the more senior people in the workplace, and they're advancing more quickly than women who choose to take the option of working remotely or of hybrid work. And this is becoming a big issue, especially now. We're still in the pandemic, but hopefully on our way out of it, and people are returning to the workplace, and I think that this is going to be a big issue going forward, the option of remote work or hybrid work. And employers should keep into consideration how can we support families and women who choose to work remotely or in a hybrid model, and not have it be detrimental to their advancement in the workplace. And that can be done in different ways. You can have designated days in the office for everyone and designated remote days for everyone, where everyone gets the same amount of face time. So that's one option.
And deliberate mentoring. I flipped you to the next slide because of the other strategy around this. Having deliberate and proactive mentoring, sponsorship, training in this hybrid world for all your workers, frankly. But in addition, to help address the disparity, to be deliberate about how you're helping women that are choosing the option of remote work.
Right, exactly. Yeah, and there are great ways to, we're a virtual firm, and there's so many ways to mentor and to still have FaceTime even remotely.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then one last option was, the paid personal days is another way of accommodating. But yeah, we can go to the next slide.
One positive thing that's coming out of the pandemic is a greater appreciation of relationship leadership, which Danielle has talked a bit about already. As we sort of go into a new era of work, which I think we absolutely are coming out of the pandemic going to do, the hybrid model or remote, just a lot more variations of how we're going to work together means that how we manage each other are going to look different. And relational leadership focuses more on the relationships between people as opposed to the cracking the whip on tasks. It's a different, more evolved style, and it's something that on Does a Global Leadership website, it's a great organization for diversity, equity, and inclusion consulting, and there's lots of them out there, but they're great for equity consulting generally. So they have a great white paper on women in leadership, and so we pulled this quote out of there, that as more corporations, agencies, and organizations recognize the pitfalls of this take charge approach versus the relational take care approach, it's a door for more female leaders to rise through the management ranks. Demonstrating and role modeling relationship leadership is a powerful way for women to leverage their natural strengths and harness diversity as a superpower in times of crisis. So, we're coming out of, this is a pro of as we come out of the pandemic, the different ways of, relationship leadership, but also results-oriented management style just gives more space for women and their different approach to management in many circumstances. A real opportunity to continue to, hopefully, as the numbers with the pandemic dipped a bit, it can continue to rise after the dust settles a bit from the pandemic.
I'm just realizing that we have 1 minute left.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll just go quickly over this. Generally, women are hesitant to join boards. These are the stats. Having more women on boards means, greater diversity of skills, experiences, opinions, strategies. It's important for women to feel like they can join boards and to encourage women to do so. Can just move on to the next slide. Right. Okay. So being aware of biases in the workplace. We wanted to talk about this quite a bit. We don't have much time, but we see this in our work a lot, where women in leadership come to us because there's been a workplace investigation launched against them, and their employee has complained about them, and how they say they really feel that the way they're acting as leaders is these issues and the complaints would not have been made were they a man, and were they if a man was behaving the same way they're behaving, which they do, this investigation would never have been triggered, and we see that a lot. So as employers, I just recommend to take that into consideration if you see that happening, if you see complaints about women leaders and women CEOs, keep the bias in mind.
Just a quick reminder: our webinars are always recorded and put onto our YouTube page. So if you do need to hop off, that's fine. We'll continue for a few more minutes to cover all the content, but you can always grab the recording after the fact. We've contrasted the two bullets here, the complaint about women leaders, and we do have this all the time. The women executives that come to us that are that have been terminated or subject of investigation, some of the feedback they get from employees. Things like she's too bossy, she's aggressive, she's cold, she doesn't listen, she's arrogant, she's impatient. If a man was behaving in a similar way, they would be a great leader. They take charge, they're impartial, they're not pushed around easily, they're confident, they get stuff done. Now, these are a polarizing comparisons. But it's never this simplistic. But in the last year, I can think of at least 3 or 4 cases what we've dealt with where this is the issue, and these stereotypes about how a woman ought to behave as a leader. It is so pervasive still, and it's not necessarily from managers; it's employees. And sometimes unsophisticated employees that don't like how their female boss is managing them, and they file the complaint. And now the organization is forced to run this investigation, and it's just super important that whoever is running the investigation, and if it's an internal investigation, that they really are aware of these biases, and these are not just semantics. It's this unconscious bias that absolutely still exists, and that we see all the time. It really is part of our practice all the time. Did you have anything on this one, Danielle, or should we go to the final topic and we can zip through it?
We can.
Termination. So, if you all of a sudden are having a bunch of women leaders leave, then obviously do some exit interviews and see what's going on. Unlikely that they will be horribly transparent, because people need to also get to the next role. But when there are any exits of your management team, it's always, especially if they're resigning. If you're as the employer, you're initiating the termination, then you know why they're leaving. But if they are resigning, it can be a really insightful step that is important to take. As part of all this, it's important to engage your frontline managers and leaders when women are resigning or leaving to really understand why there is an exit happening. And if you're the HR team, it's a good moment to repeat the business case for diversity, equity, and inclusion training, talk about the cost of turnover, bad press, human rights, exposure, etc. What we do observe, we do a lot of work for clients in the tech space. These founders that are more often than not men that have these amazing creative and technical skills that got this organization up and running. We're now a couple of years into it, and they're not there to as a charity. They're there to make a business and to run a business. And when your top person is engaging in these behaviors, it's really challenging. We were often dealing with that, and so if the HR, I know, can have a really important role here. Sometimes you need to bypass the CEO and go talk to the board of directors. If that doesn't go anywhere, sometimes HR has to initiate the harassment complaint. It's really complicated. But again, if there's microaggressions happening to one person, it's likely happening to others, and it's an expensive situation for the organization. Finally, on termination, it's very important to avoid stereotypes about the exit package and the process generally that then trigger anger at this ex-employee who doesn't live up to these stereotypes. And this actually happens all the time. These assumptions that, she's, let's be a bit softer and a little more gentle. And no one uses those words, but the behavior or the approach is, let's be nice. Let's, not be too hard on her. She's going to be really upset, which is, she's not going to push back aggressively. Let's just, get her a reasonable package, but it's actually, that it's a lowball offer. All of these stereotypes about how women are likely to engage in the termination process. What we then see is, no, they will often push back just as much as men, and they will often, just as much as men, hire a lawyer who will be happy to push back. And so what I have then seen often is the employer is now ticked that this person is behaving so irrationally and so angrily and so aggressively in the context of the termination process. So it's stereotypes feeding on stereotypes that really make for an unnecessarily escalated situation. And this is not 10 years ago. I can think of an example from last week. So it's when women do defy stereotypes, it can be unnerving. And so it's just something to be mindful in that termination process. Fire women as you would fire your men and move on. It shouldn't be complicated. Danielle, you want to talk about our key takeaways?
Sure. So key takeaways. You can move to the next slide.
Yes.
So basically, avoid pitfalls when hiring and when hiring women. Think of how to support women in the workplace. Keep in mind biases and microaggressions that exist, and avoid pitfalls when terminating women.
Okay, thank you. Most people hung on to the end, so thank you very much for joining us on our webinar today. This concludes our webinar. If you do have any questions, as you can tell, we love this topic and are very happy to answer any questions you may have. We're recording this and we'll be posting it on our YouTube channel within a day or two. Feel free to come to our website if you have any questions and would like to look into more. Our next webinar is on June 15. Every third Wednesday of the month at 10:30 a.m. webinars. And the next one is going to court employment law litigation tips. So if you have any litigation matters on the go and you'd like some litigation tips, two of our lawyers will be talking about that. Please join us on our social platforms, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, our monthly newsletter. And thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.